There's two things that are really important. The first is that you need to be thoughtful about the communities and niches that your target voters are spending their time in to make sure that you're actually reaching them and delivering advertising or messaging at a frequency that captures their attention. The second thing is that the style of content across all these niches looks really different. Trying to reach someone who spends a lot of time watching gaming content on YouTube versus trying to reach someone who watches Get Ready With Me beauty and fashion content on YouTube, the content looks different, and so therefore our messaging, both in substance and in style, should look different too. And that's the area where I really want to see progressives grow in 2025.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Campaign Strategist. I'm Pete Altman. Today our guest is Nick Ahamed, the Deputy Executive Director at Priorities USA, one of the nation's leading progressive advocacy organizations. With a background in analytics and political partnerships, Nick oversees the group's strategies for data-driven campaigning, opinion research, and collaboration with progressive allies. Previously, he served as Director of Analytics at Priorities USA, leading efforts in targeting, ad testing, and election forecasting for major national campaigns. Nick earned a Master's of Philosophy in Politics and International Relations from the University of Cambridge, where he was a Gates Scholar researching voter turnout. Welcome, Nick, and thank you so much for joining us here on the pod.
Pete, really looking forward to this conversation. Glad to be here.
Would you mind just starting off by telling us about how you got into this work? Clearly, you've had a long-term interest in it, given your studies.
My story is not that uncommon in that, for me, it was really activated by Barack Obama. I'm an immigrant to this country. I had no connection to DC, to politics. My parents weren't citizens. I wanted, I think, a typical corporate career until I saw President Obama in 2008 and said, if he can become president, like, I can make an impact on my community too. And that's really what first got me interested. And then I was an organizer on his 12 campaign, and that's sort of what started my professional career in campaign strategy.
One of the biggest subjects of discussion in progressive circles, electoral and advocacy, and that I heard you speak about very recently at the America Vote Summit, is the challenge of how we need to adapt to the modern communications landscape. And I'm curious, what are the biggest misunderstandings you think people have about how media works in 2025 and how we need to adapt to that?
Yeah, I think 2024 was a big election for someone who specializes in digital advertising, because it was one of the first elections where we saw as much being invested in digital communication as we saw on traditional broadcast cable radio communication. That was great. However, the approach to digital was trying to mimic what the strategy normally is on broadcast, which is let's try to reach everyone with a 30-second TV ad or TV style ad, and just if we get in front of them, that's what matters. That's not what works on the internet. The internet is a lot more of a complicated environment. If you think about YouTube, for example, which I know we're going to talk a lot about today, YouTube is not just like a normal, cable subscription. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of channels, and people spend a lot of time in very specific niches. It's not like you have ABC, NBC, CBS. It's a lot more fragmented. It's a lot more niche. And there's two things that are really important for that. The first is that you need to be thoughtful about the communities and niches that your target voters are spending their time in to make sure that you're actually reaching them and delivering advertising or messaging at a frequency that captures their attention. The second thing is that the style of content across all these niches looks really different. Trying to reach someone who spends a lot of time watching gaming content on YouTube versus trying to reach someone who watches Get Ready With Me beauty and fashion content on YouTube, the content looks different, and so therefore our messaging, both in substance and in style, should look different too. And that's the area where I really want to see progressives grow in 2025.
I'm really curious to get to that, particularly because I'm a gamer and I'm one of those people who actually watches other people play video games. Before we get there, help paint this picture of how much things have changed. Like you said, the old model of big TV ad buys is just broken. Why is that? What's happening in this space right now that makes that true?
It's happened slowly to the extent that even in 2020, at Priorities, we were splitting our budget equally between traditional television and digital media. And we did this study with Nielsen and Google trying to understand the impact of a gross rating point. A gross rating point is the standard way that television ad buys are measured. And theoretically, 1,000 points, which is the gold standard, means that you're reaching 100% of your audience 10 times. So we did this experiment with Nielsen, and we found actually 1,000 gross rating points means that we're reaching 50% of the audience 20 times. So even 5 years ago, we were only reaching half of the people we needed to reach. That has dramatically accelerated to the point where traditional advertising is really focused on a very small segment of the population that watches a lot of TV and has a typical broadcast subscription. The rest of the audience is diversified across streaming platforms, think Netflix, HBO Max, but also what we call free ad-supported platforms like Tubi or Pluto TV or Roku. Short-form video content like TikTok has obviously taken off dramatically since 2020, but also YouTube Shorts, Instagram Reels, Facebook Reels. So there's really this plethora of styles and formats of content that people are consuming every day and oftentimes at the same time as each other, watching something on Hulu while they're also scrolling on TikTok, that kind of thing.
Who TV can actually reach now has changed so much. Seems to be a lesson that some are learning faster than others. What do you think the sort of obstacle is? How is it that TV still has a real hold on how people think about their communications?
There's a couple aspects of it. One of which is certainly that for a lot of candidates, they've been working with consultants since their first race. And those consultants are rooted in approaches to messaging and messaging strategies that are from that person's first race. So putting that aside, because I think those consultants bring a lot of richness and value and experience to the party that's also important, I think there are a couple aspects to it. The first of which are assumptions about who are important voters to reach. I think there's often a notion that the folks that we need to persuade are consistent voters, that consistent voters tend to be older voters, and older voters spend more time on television. It's true that those voters do spend more time on television, but our definition of who a persuadable target is certainly has to change coming out of 2024. We've been at Priorities saying for a long time that young voters of color are a really important persuasion audience, that they're not hearing much from Democrats, and that was clearly true in the results. And it's broader than just young voters of color. It's young voters generally and a lot of voters of color generally. Those voters far over-index on their online consumption. YouTube is the most important platform, for example, for reaching Latino voters. Tubi, which is a free ad-supported platform, is the number 2 platform for reaching Black voters. And so as we change who we think our audience is, that will also mean changes in where we're spending our media dollars in terms of platforms. The other aspect of it is this assumption that live TV is the highest quality inventory because someone is choosing to sit down and watch that, whereas other kinds of advertising might be skippable, might be scrollable, people can tune out. But I think we need to change that notion in 2 ways. The first is that when a commercial break turns on or goes on, someone's probably scrolling on their phone at the same time, right? The number of multi-device interactions is increasing. And the second is that a lot of those prime television events are moving into the digital space. There's a lot more, for example, sporting events that are on streaming platforms in addition to live TV. And that's important inventory that we should be reaching to.
It's funny, that idea. If you're watching live TV, you're going to sit and watch the commercials, because not that kids are the target, but I mean, I remember as a kid, that was when you got to go to the bathroom or like get a snack, and whoever you were watching with would be like, tell me when the commercials are ending.
Exactly.
Anyway, I know in November of 2023, Priorities said we're going to spend $75 million online. Did you actually raise that much money to spend online in 2024? I saw one report on Open Secrets that sort of the spending was much lower, and it just got me wondering, is that because it's hard to get donors to come along, or I'm misreading reports? But I'm just curious, like, is that working in terms of getting donors to make this pivot?
We did not end up raising and spending as much as we wanted to. What's available on Open Secrets doesn't describe all of the activity that Priorities USA does. For example, we also have a pretty heavy litigation arm out of Priorities USA Foundation that does things like making sure that you can register to vote using an e-signature instead of just a wet signature. So we've got a full sort of scope of how we think about what online engagement means. I think 2024 was a really hard fundraising year for a lot of people. The Harris campaign raised an enormous amount of money. One other super PAC, Future Forward, raised an enormous amount of money. And there was a philosophy that as long as we just reach people, that's enough. And I think our takeaway coming out of 2024 is that the messenger and the style of content delivery really matters. And that there are lots of groups with different expertise on different issues, different audiences, different formats that are an important part of a progressive coalition to reach people effectively. Some donors really get it vis-a-vis the internet. Some donors are more of a challenge, but everyone is, I think, increasingly understanding the importance of digital communication in their own lives. And so it's an easier and easier conversation to have than it was, say, in 2018 when I started at Priorities. My experience this year so far is that a lot of folks are burnt out. They feel like they gave a lot of money, gave a lot of time, a lot of mental capacity over the first Trump administration, and then obviously in the last 4 years. So I think folks across donors, but also partners and stakeholders are taking a step back and saying, what's the right way for me to make impact in this moment?
One of the messages that I've been hearing from your organization and a number of others is there is not going to be an answer. You have to invest money and you have to experiment and you have to iterate and you have to be willing to take risks in order to start finding out what works. And that seems like something that, for reasons, if you've got any insight into, I'm all ears, the right has strangely been really effective at, I guess, or willing to do. And it's been harder to get experimentation on the left. What do you think is going on there? And is that really the key right now, is we just have to try a lot of things and use that to figure out what works?
Yeah, I think certainly the primary way this is played out in progressive politics over the last couple cycles is that you can do all this research in a laboratory environment, find the best testing ad with the audience it, resonates with, and then just deploy it at scale in the last 2 months. From our vantage point in 2024, ads that tested really well in a laboratory and then were completely flat on a screen. And the flip side, we saw ads from the right that supposedly didn't do well in a laboratory environment, but clearly resonated with folks. And the example I'd give is the Kamala's for They Them ad. And there's two aspects to this story for me. The first is that in an interview with Ezra Klein, David Shore, who's a Democratic data scientist, said that this ad only tested in the 70th percentile of right-wing ads that they tested. So he gave it a C minus, I think. 70th percentile to me is a C minus. But yet here we are talking about it. Like, it's been the topic of conversation in terms of right-wing strategy. And so clearly there's a stickiness to it. And when we only think about what a survey respondent who you're paying to take the survey thinks about an ad, we're missing the real, living, breathing aspect of the internet. The flip side of that story for me is in our postmortem research, we asked people what they heard from both sides of the aisle in terms of messaging. And a non-trivial portion of people for whom politics is not important to their identity, so not disengaged politically voters, a non-trivial amount of them thought that message on trans voters was coming from Kamala Harris herself, because the first 5 or 10 seconds of that ad was a clip of her in 2019. And that's all they saw, because then they skipped, scrolled, or tuned out, and then they didn't get that it was a Trump ad. They thought that that's what her campaign was talking about. When we have these really forced view laboratory environments, we're totally missing the messiness of the internet. And especially with low information voters, who are the voters that we need to persuade and mobilize, we're just getting half the story and we're making bad strategic decisions as a result.
So how do you test it in the real world environment? How do you measure and assess? Are they watching the whole thing? Are they just watching the first couple seconds? That must be a whole new area of science to itself now.
That's a lot of the challenge that we're taking on at Priorities this calendar year, 2025, is thinking about a little bit less, how do we boil this down to one number and say we're not going to have the silver bullet analytical solution? What are all the qualitative and quantitative data points that we can say, hey, we think this is resonating, or we think this is capturing some nugget? Is a creator sharing the video if we share it to our social feeds? Are people responding in the comments, some actual genuine dialogue about the content of the message? Are people choosing to watch, complete this ad at a higher rate than other content that we're putting out there? There's all these little signals that we have, none of them which tell the whole picture, but we can together paint a little bit of a more vivid understanding of what's resonating in the real world.
It's like a holistic approach to listening to all of the different kinds of indicators.
One of which is
paint the overall picture.
That sort of ad testing in a laboratory environment. We want to be sure if we're putting something out into the world that it's not going to backlash, but we can't ask this tool to do more than it's really scientifically capable. What we want to know is that if we're putting something out, we think it's going to work, and then from that suite of things we think is going to work, what's going to take off?
From your perspective, when advocacy organizations hear digital strategy, what's the sense that you get that they have in mind, and how well is that matching up with what you've identified? Are we getting there to understanding it, or are we just at the very beginning of comprehending this?
I think we're somewhere in the middle. I want to say that this task is really difficult. The internet is designed for corporations to get signals based off of your behavior, what you're searching for, what you're clicking on, to track you, follow you, and then be the last brand message before you make that purchase. If you're trying to buy shoes, that's what Nike is trying to do. They're trying to say, right before you decide what shoe to buy, it should be a Nike. And that has been what Democrats' approach to advertising online is, that we're going to get all this information about you, and right before you cast that ballot, we're going to get that out in front of you to say to vote for Kamala Harris. But Republicans have been thought about it maybe a little bit more like car dealership strategy, which is they just want you to know that they're an option. They have a lot more touch points throughout the year for you to be reminded that they're there. They have these non-political, values-based entry points to the conversation that maybe it has nothing to do with Donald Trump. Maybe it's something you're interested in. And then 8 episodes later, then they're introducing an issue or a candidate. And then they're talking about voting, right? So I think we need to think differently, less transactionally about delivering these messages and more of like an overall funnel of engagement.
What's an example of that where people get a tidbit of something that's got that cultural lens, or reaching them in a space that's for them is their part of their culture, that just introduces a topic and gradually results in more and more aligning with that, and then suddenly the person's like, well, maybe I want to consider Donald Trump.
The perfect example right now is the Make America Healthy Again movement. That starts with watching maybe a video about raw milk on Instagram. And you might get to raw milk because you're interested in food and cooking content, or you're interested in healthy living or some sort of exercise. And then from raw milk, you go to trad wife niche, traditional wife, which is like values of like they're going to stay at home and cook meals and provide for their husband. And then you go from trad wife to Maha lifestyle generally, and then you go to RFK, and RFK is giving you a message about Donald Trump. This is then a feedback loop. There was a Republican super PAC called RBG PAC, which was funded by Elon Musk, which was this awful thing saying that actually Trump was not against abortion. And if you looked at who they were targeting on Facebook based off their interest targeting, it was targeting things like granola moms or yoga moms, and trying to capture this sort of feedback loop of we're going to get people into these lifestyle funnels that go into political and values funnels, and then we're going to retarget them with political content.
I'm intrigued by how come the right seems to sort of get it, or why does it seem like their stuff fits in it? Why do you think we struggle with this on the left?
I think we have these very prescriptive ways of thinking of and talking about issues that are driven by polling and message testing and ad testing. So it's difficult to say, okay, I've got this 76 word segment I want delivered. And so what's going to be the right, cultural upstream touch point to introduce that? And instead, I think we might say, let's take 100 bets on different creators. We don't know which of these is going to be right or salient or feel right in the moment for what issue comes up in 3 months, but we want to have someone who we can activate if there's a message that makes sense. And I think that's what the right does well. Like, I don't think we have a perspective on where their messaging doesn't come through, isn't native to the person that they supported. We just see the success cases, when you see it because they've activated that way, right? I think it might take us taking some risks in who we engage, who we support, and not being afraid to fail in that regard. And I think the other aspect of it to me is Republicans, I think, are not afraid to take on issues and make issues that are maybe their weakness a big focus. The RBG PAC is probably the best example of that, where they were clear that abortion was a much stronger issue for Kamala Harris than it was for Donald Trump, and that raising the salience of abortion was probably a bad idea. But they dumped a lot of money into taking a really big bet and saying, actually, I think there's a narrow segment we can convince that Trump is not bad on abortion and that the economy is more important. In my experience, when Democrats are aware that they have a vulnerability, they just are ostriches. They just hope that issue is not going to come up, rather than doing any form of inoculation or getting ahead of the issue and saying yeah, this is my stance on X. I'm unapologetic about it. I think that's what was really admirable in my view of Pete Buttigieg going on the Flagrant podcast this week, of saying, hey, this is an environment where I'm not going to agree with these people 90% of the time. I'm not going to be particularly comfortable in this environment, but I am unafraid of going on and defending what I stand for. And the more that we can see behaviors and appearances like that from our candidates and, messengers who are unapologetic about what they stand for and what they believe in, I think that kind of conviction will really resonate with voters.
You also mentioned we don't even see all of the attempts the right made that failed. Got me thinking, maybe there were 19 other ways they tried to corral the abortion issue that just didn't work. One of the things that I've heard recently from practitioners is that the right is very, very good at paying attention to what's working and then jumping on that. I mean, Trump himself models this behavior that sounds like you need to take on the internet, which is try a bunch of crap out and see what's actually working. That was always evident in his rallies, right? Where he would try out all kinds of stuff. And basically, he's got 10,000 person focus groups right there. When I think about, as an advocate, the challenge of relinquishing control control of the message. It seems to me it's obviously an imperative, but it also runs counter to how a lot of organizations have done it. I mean, it seems clear one of the challenges, you have to let that go, because in order to get to the volume and the reach that is possible with the internet, you can't script it, because that's only going to work for a specific audience. So now I'm just telling you things that you probably already know instead of
No,
asking you
I think
questions.
you're
But
spot on. I think there's a balance to it. So instead of having a script for someone to read, a creator, an influencer to read, maybe you have a message brief, right? These are the bounds that we want you to stay within. Like, these are the kinds of things that we think are effective, that we are comfortable with. But, let them build on that, put it in their voice, do what they do best of delivering a message that they know, because they get instant feedback on whether someone's watching that. Not an individual, but they get instant feedback. That's why they are, have that livelihood. They're really good at it. Let's let them do that, but then also give them a sandbox to color within the lines of.
the way I look at the whole media landscape is like when the comet wiped out the dinosaurs. You can take the metaphor a certain distance. They're not entirely gone, but they're not as prominent as they used to be. And it created huge openings for new critters to flourish and adapt and maybe fail or maybe survive and keep going. I feel like that's kind of where we're at right now in terms of this media landscape, where there's going to be a lot of little organisms that have to try things out, and some are going to work, some aren't, but you got to try. You have to adapt or die. How should groups be thinking about how to move forward?
I have two thoughts in response to that question. The first of which is, not every group needs to do everything. And I think that goes back to my earlier point about how groups can get and should be funded to do the thing that they do really, really well. Now, I'm not saying that's how the funding landscape works. I'm just saying that's how I think it should work. As a collective, we need to coordinate to make sure that if you are messaging on climate on TikTok, that there's also someone doing that on Instagram. So that's one sort of thought. The other one is that a core challenge we face is that the platforms that are easiest for people to have that sort of initial success on are not necessarily the platforms where we need all of our time and energy to go. And by that, I mean emerging platforms like TikTok or Threads or Blue Sky, where they're in their sort of nascent period. It's the easiest time for a small organization or someone doing this for the first time to get big and grow. It's much harder to go to an established platform like YouTube and get to the same sort of volume of reach as you are on TikTok. But we cannot forget about these really, really big platforms, even if they're difficult. And YouTube, I think, is the center of that universe for me, where we are torn between treating it just like a television screen or broadcast TV, but it is such a vibrant ecosystem that is different from every other either long form or short form video, that we really need a concerted investment from progressives to build organic presence on, both in a long form, like hour-long episodes, and in a short form, YouTube Shorts, which is really dominated by conservative voices and young men in particular right now.
I have so many questions. I'm struggling to decide which to ask first, because I really want to get to the YouTube experiments that you did with gamers and foodies, but I'm really keen to know, you talked about coordinating, like if one group is good at TikTok, another group is good on this space. How does the right coordinate, like their podcasters are not on weekly conference calls together for sure, right? So how do they do that? And maybe what does that mean? How do we do that? More importantly, I guess.
I don't know that I have the, perfect insight into how the right does it, but it seems to me that they take bets or funding structures that have an expectation of return on investment over a much longer period of time. And without that intense scarcity mindset of, am I going to be afloat at the end of the election cycle or at the end of the year, there's a lot more comfort in collaboration. And in the organic space in particular, what that means is that you have Jordan Peterson showing up on Ben Shapiro's show. You have a lot more lifting up of another voice's content on your own platform. Like, here's a clip I saw from X. Here are my thoughts on it. There's a lot more cross collaboration, fertilization. I love that word. Whereas on the progressive side, I think there's a lot more competition because there's a perceived scarcity of resources, which means I can't recognize or acknowledge that that person is good at what they do because I'm trying to get their resources for myself. Right. And so we need a financial environment where the expectation and commitment of funding is on a much longer runway, so that there fosters that sort of sense of security and, desire for collaboration.
That's such an interesting insight. One, because I've seen that behavior in the advocacy community pre-digital. Like, that's just been how the community has often functioned, competing for scarce dollars. And the right has been very good and smart about investing for the long term, which is like a whole other topic I'm really fascinated by and want to better understand. You talked about priorities, playing around with, engaging the gamer community on YouTube. Tell me about it.
One of our core strategies in 2024 was understanding that people don't sort themselves demographically or geographically on the internet. They sort themselves by their interests, communities, niches. We cared a lot about reaching young voters and voters of color outside of where they were geographically dense. We know that field operations, they're going to target black voters in neighborhoods where they can knock a lot of black voters' doors. That there are organizations targeting youth voters and they're going to go to college campuses, but there are a lot of black voters, Latino voters, Asian voters, young voters who live in areas where they're the minority. There's not a lot of their other demographic group in that same zip code. And so we need to reach them even if it's inefficient or they're difficult to target, and that their online behaviors might be a way to do that. We called that the Margins Project, that we really need to reach people wherever they are and make sure that we're getting every, marginal vote to turn out and support Kamala Harris. A lot of that was leaning into these internet niches as a way of reaching people based off of gaming, food and cooking, get ready with me, beauty and fashion, and a lot of media consumption research we did to understand where our different constituency groups were spending their time. As we started to go through that, we realized that the content in these spaces was very different. Like you said, someone watching someone play a video game is really, really different than, an episode of Top Chef on Peacock. As a result, our content should probably look different so that someone doesn't see a political ad and be like, oh, that's propaganda. And so we thought about an experiment where we said, we're going to run an ad about abortion and abortion rights. We're going to make a standard political ad, the normal ad that we would ship in the situation or use in advertising in the situation. And then we're also going to work with a number of creatives and creators to say, what might this look like in a food and cooking context? Or what might this look like in a fashion and beauty context? And then we ran a series of experiments where we targeted food and cooking or fashion and beauty or gaming with either content that looked native to that niche or the standard political ad. And then we compared the efficacy of those two kinds of content. And in every situation, we found that the content that looked native to the niche outperformed the standard political ad. The reason that's really important is that when we did a standard political ad test in a forced environment like we were talking about earlier, the standard political ad did best. These survey-based ways of measuring whether it works don't capture the vibrancy and culture of the internet, and so we need to be making a lot more content as a party to just see what resonates and what works in different online spaces.
That was tailoring ads to match the culture of that affinity group that you were aiming at. One of my favorite channels is Cinema Sins, which makes fun of movies. One of the things I've come to notice is part of how they call out movies is the treatment of different kinds of cultures and ethnicities. And they're also very attuned to the importance of mental health. It's not democratic messaging. It's just be a decent human being messaging. That's my momentary epiphany into how you integrate. Well, that's obviously would be in the context of working with creators. And you've also worked with creators. How did that go?
It went well. I think, in the example that you offered, that's a good example of starting with culture and then going to values. I think the next challenge is that we got to get those folks to talk about, issues, candidates, and voting. But a core challenge that we hear when we talk to a lot of non-political creators, which is our sort of focus at Priorities, is that they don't want to take a risk on backlash. That, they say I don't talk about politics, that they're, don't want to get a lot of comments, responses, on, losing followers, because that will have other implications for brand deals. That if they lose a lot of followers, that it's going to be harder for them to get Clinique or whatever, right? And part of the core challenge there is that there's not a belief that progressives are going to be around to support them after the election. That the same sort of short-term funding that we see, that we talked about, just a few minutes ago, has implications for creators too, because they need to know that they're going to have a livelihood in a few months. And they saw a huge cliff after November where Democrats just stopped showing up. And so we need to develop these relationships with creators. We're making a commitment to them if we want them to go out on a limb and talk about things that they might get some backlash for. And that's a core challenge moving forward. The parallel to that is that I think we will get more good content out of them if it's more of a Shark Tank or a VC model than a gig economy. Let's invest in people. Let's educate them. Let's make them really effective messengers on a specific issue that they're passionate about. Instead of just saying, hey, I want you to post this specific thing. I want a ride from here to there on Uber, right? Move more to investing in people and their ideas and their businesses and less into, a specific service. I think that's also how the right does it. Thinking about Turning Point USA, for for example. They've got this model of going onto college campuses and they have these huge conventions, where 1,000 people maybe attend. And maybe out of those 1,000 people, they see 100 who they think have a knack for creating some sort of content. And then out of those 100, maybe there's 10 that can grow their following, to a substantial amount in a year. And then out of those 10, maybe there's one who can turn that into a business. And now that person is a voice of the right.
And they're launched and it becomes self-sustaining. So they're creating farm teams.
Exactly.
Basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. One of many things we need on the left is resources dedicated to long-term cultivation and support of content creation. One of the things that I find fascinating about the Federalist Society model is they just created nodes for networking at college campuses and then cross-fertilized by having conferences and ways for, the people at the different chapters to meet each other. And they brought in judges and lawyers whose careers are established to meet with these young people. Like they created an entire ecosystem to pipeline young conservative people into the law and then onto the bench or into the law firms and whatever. And obviously that has paid off. But it seems like, I assume there isn't a name for that kind of a model, but since everything really does come down to relationships, it seems highly applicable to this world as well. And what you're characterizing from Turning Point, it sounds very similar in terms of creating those nodes for people to gather and then connect with each other. And of course, they also have scouts. I assume the Federalist Society does actually, for that matter as well.
Just think about how long the Federalist Society has been around, right? Or think about the movement to overturn Roe. That took them 50 years of consistent engagement and movement building, political strategy through the courts to get a Supreme Court that overturned Roe. The idea that we're going to be able to turn around and change something in a year, in 6 months, or in a presidency just has a different view of the timeline than conservatives bring to their political movement.
Who is doing a good job of trying out things and identifying what's working in this new world?
I think there are a lot of groups. I think, we work closely with many of the in-state groups who know their states and communities best, like Commonwealth Communications is one of our close allies in Pennsylvania. A Better Wisconsin Together is one of our close allies in Wisconsin, who had some really good strategies in their Supreme Court race this month. At the national level, we have allies like at Courier Newsroom, had this notion of we need to think about how to deliver news differently, but also have built up a really good organic and TikTok and vertical video delivery of news. So I think there are a lot of people who are trying things and finding success. And the realization is that we need as a party is that it's not going to just be like Courier is going to solve all of our problems. What Courier does is really good. It's that we need like 1,000 couriers doing different things, right?
Yeah, you need a whole bunch of species to figure out what is going to fit in the new ecosystem.
Exactly.
What do you think are the most important things for people to be thinking about, given that it's a long road? How do we apply lessons most effectively for like 2026 and 2028?
2028 is a harder one for me to answer because it's difficult to say at this moment, like what the TikTok of 2028 is going to be. And I feel pretty confident it's not going to be TikTok, right? It might not even be something that's on the App Store right now.
I heard your point before that you want to get it established on an emerging platform. It's harder to break into the established ones. Yeah.
And so I think the lesson there is that like we need to do both of those things well. We need to tread water and continue engagement on the platforms where people already are spending their time. And we need to try everything out and say, you know what, this might not exist in a month. It might not resonate. Blue sky might not be relevant, but we need to be there in the case that it is. And that really requires a comfortableness failing that I don't think we have right now. And so for me, that's a big lesson learned of just like everything might not pay off, but if you're making all these bets, the thing that does pay off will really pay off. In terms of other lessons learned thinking about 2026, one of the things that's taking your question in a little bit of a different direction that's really clear to me from 2024 is that we need a lot more emotion and conviction in what we're saying to voters. That when we look at where Democrats spent their ad dollars, it was overwhelmingly on the economy. But when we look at what voters recall hearing from Democrats, it was much more to be about abortion. The debate there isn't about the economy versus abortion in terms of messaging. It's that our abortion ads were really good. They were really emotional. They packed a punch and voters believed what we had to say. We said it with conviction. That was missing on the economic front. And so as we think about 2026, we know the economy is always in some form one of voters' top concerns. And so we need to have both a policy platform that answers people's concerns, but also have it delivered in a way that really has emotion and connects with people so that they hear and feel what we're saying and not just, think about a tax credit they're going to get in April.
To take a point from something that you mentioned and and others have talked about, you can't just wait till September or October of 2026 to gin up the machine. Everything has to be on all the time.
That was one of the core challenges of 2024 is that while we had Biden at the top of the ticket, they were really focused on talking about their accomplishments at a moment that voters just weren't feeling it. And I mean, in a literal sense, many of the policies had not actually had any impact on voters because they were still being processed. And regardless, voters were very economically frustrated. The Harris campaign had a number of really good policy proposals around housing, affordability, around entrepreneurship that we were trying to pick up and run with. But in the short time frame that we had to create ads, get them out and deliver to voters, in a media environment as fragmented as we have, you need a longer runway to actually deliver that message and have people hear and digest and feel it. And so I'm hopeful that as we think about 2026 and especially 2028, we can put forward some policies with enough runway that we can tell that story with conviction and reach people so that they remember it on election day. Like 2 months is not enough time to do that.
I've door knocked in multiple cycles, but this is the first time I ever felt like no matter what I say, there's no change in the eyes. So you can tell they're not actually hearing you, even though you're standing there. And I just felt like because they have been wrapped in whatever the social media feed stuff is for months, and they're just going right back into their house to pick that up again. And I think the field campaign knocked the doors and talked to people repeatedly, but it's still a tremendous amount to try to overcome. And it absolutely requires that we're more in that digital space. I want to go back to, you mentioned Latinos and like the YouTube pre-roll. I'm interested to hear more about what you found this cycle about engaging with young Latinos. Any particular lessons, like what worked, what didn't, how to reach and engage those that are disengaged?
I don't want to necessarily single out young Latinos because I think there's a lot of cross-race learnings here that in a lot of respects, young Latinos are a lot more like younger voters generally or younger voters of color than they are in some respects like older Latinos. And so the dynamics here are really intersectional and complicated. But the point I think overall is that YouTube is the platform for reaching young men in particular, and that they're treating it like long-form content. Like this podcast that Pete Buttigieg went on is 3 hours long. And someone might sit down and watch that, in one evening or break it over a couple of days, but like it's not your 2-minute how do I unclog my sink video.
What do you know actually about the watching habits of those long form things? Like, do people like sit down at a desk or in their armchair with their iPad or phone and watch Joe Rogan for 3 hours? Or
some people, yeah, like they might put it on their TV and put it on the background and
just going around doing their household chores and stuff, which is how I watch a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Is listening while I'm doing boring stuff.
Something like that. Yeah. And that's what I think this podcast debate, is so fixated on the term podcast or so fixated on Rogan. But I think half the podcast debate is actually a YouTube debate. That a lot of where this specifically is happening isn't just audio on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or whatever. It's happening on YouTube. And that's a really important thing that we need to think about. It's also an important thing that we need to think about as ad makers, that like we communicate a lot of information, usually via text on screen or what's physically shown on the video. But someone might only be listening to that. And so what we're communicating auditorially is as important as what we're or in some cases, specifically in the podcast realm, more important than what is showing up on the screen. Often we're using news headlines to validate what we're saying, all these things, and people just might not honestly be seeing that at all. And so that's, I think, part of the core challenge of YouTube as a platform, and why I'm so focused on it is like, it is not just a 15-second video that you're forcing to someone to watch. It is a whole different and really segmented way of consuming media that we're just honestly at the tip of the iceberg about. We've launched a new project at Priorities we're calling Warbler. We have a flagship product called Ad Hoc. The intent of Warbler is to think about that sort of media consumption information in a much broader way than political organizations typically do. And one of the projects we want to do, for example, is let's find 10 young men who just watch YouTube all night. Like that is their television. And can we sit on the couch with them and see what that experience is like? How are they choosing what to watch? How are they choosing when to fast forward? What are they doing when there are pre-roll ads coming up? Are they going around, their house and doing their chores while they're listening? Like just adding a little bit more color, because advocacy and political operatives, although different and varied, have their own biases in how they consume media. And it's often very difficult for them to grasp that like someone just watches YouTube, doesn't pay for TV. And so how can we add color to that understanding to get them to see how their ads should show up?
I get it. I'm old and I don't pay for cable. And I haven't watched live TV. I can't remember how long it's been.
And I'm a young man of color, and like I watch YouTube sometimes, but certainly not as my primary form of entertainment. We're all different, right? And
Yeah,
we really need to, as the internet gets more and more complicated, we really need to invest a lot more in understanding how people are different from us, because the areas where everyone watched Walter Cronkite are gone, and yet some of our
right,
strategies from
right.
that era are still here.
I like to wrap with asking about what's a piece of advice that you got from a mentor or a lesson you learned early on you'd like to pass on to others.
I think the best work advice I ever got was to find the 20% of your boss's job that they hate and do it for them, because
Oh, that's a good one.
you'll learn how to do your boss's job. You'll make their life better, get them spending more time doing the things that they want to do, getting them in the rooms that they want to be in instead of doing, budgeting or accounting or whatever it is. And then when they get elevated, you know how to do your boss's job for them and you're the natural successor. So that's worked for me so far.
That's a great one. I love it. Nick, thank you so much for spending time with me. I really appreciate it. This has been a fascinating conversation.
Likewise, Pete, I really enjoyed it. And honestly, anytime I get to talk about YouTube, I will.
Excellent. Thanks for tuning into The Campaign Strategist, where we dive into the art and science of advocacy. The podcast is produced by Prismatic Strategies to share wisdom and insights from leaders in the field. I'm your host, Pete Altman. Music was written by Andrea Perry and Pete Altman, and this is edited by Abby Altman. If you enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with others who care about making a difference. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again, and see you next time.